The topic is John Dryden's Preface to the Fables. My dear students of the first MA English of the Directorate of Distance Education of Annamalai University, John Dryden's Preface to Fables is prescribed for you for detailed study in paper 2, that is Restoration and 18th Century English Literature. Now, let us analyze the salient features of Dryden's Preface to the Fables. John Dryden belongs to the 18th century. 18th century is often described as an age of prose and reason. Matthew Arnold describes this age as an excellent and indispensable 18th century. John Dryden wanted to write a great epic poem like Paradise Lost, but he gave the idea because it was an age of prose, it was also an age of translations. So John Dryden began to translate stories from other languages into English and published a volume called Fables Ancient and Modern. Fables Ancient and Modern is a massive volume consisting of translations from Greek, Latin and Old English. For this massive volume, Dryden wrote a preface. That preface is prescribed for you. The Preface to Fables is the last important work by John Dryden. So it is called a swan song. It is said that the bird swan sang very beautifully before it dies. The last song of the bird is supposed to be a marvelous song. So also any last important work is called a swan song. Preface to Fables is a swan song of John Dryden, the father of English criticism, in appreciation of Chaucer, the father of English poetry. John Dryden is a father of English criticism. Chaucer is called the father of English poetry. The father of English criticism analyzes the artistic merits of the father of English poetry. That is the theme of this text. When John Dryden translated Ovid's stories into English, he thought of Chaucer. He found a comparison between Ovid and Chaucer. While translating Ovid's Metamorphoses, John Dryden thought of Chaucer, his countryman. Both resembled alike in many respects. Both borrowed ideas, stories from other writers. Ovid, the Latin writer, borrowed stories from Greek writers. Chaucer borrowed stories from Italian writers. Both presented lifelike characters. Both presented the life of the times. But yet Dryden says Chaucer is superior because Ovid wrote when Latin was in its meridian. Ovid wrote when Latin language was enjoying a glorious period. Ovid wrote at the close of the golden age of the Roman tongue. Roman tongue means Roman language. Chaucer wrote when English was in a state of infancy. English was just beginning to grow. Ovid wrote when Latin language enjoyed a glorious period. Ovid wrote at the end of the golden age. Chaucer wrote at the dawning of our English language, when English was just beginning to grow. Not only that, even in the portrayal of characters, Chaucer is superior to Ovid. Ovid portrayed a character called Narcissus. Narcissus is a name of a character. Narcissus is on his deathbed, is about to die, but in his deathbed he speaks of love, wit, humor, indulgence in glittering trifles. It is something unnatural, artificial, unrealistic. Dryden says, will any man who is ready to die for love express his passions like a Narcissus when the poor wretch was in the agony of death? So a man is about to die, but he speaks of love. That is unnatural. He compares and contrasts this with Chaucer's portrayal of a character called Arcite. Arcite is Chaucer's character. Arcite is also on his deathbed, but Chaucer maintains the seriousness, maintains the gravity of the situation. So Chaucer's portrayal of characters is natural, it is realistic. So Dryden says that Chaucer is superior to Ovid in all respects. Then he speaks of Boccaccio. John Dryden was translating Boccaccio's Decameron. Boccaccio is an Italian writer. After all, Chaucer borrowed stories from Boccaccio. So we think that the lender, Boccaccio, is a superior. Dryden says no. Though Chaucer borrowed from Boccaccio, Chaucer is superior. Boccaccio also might have borrowed stories from other writers. Chaucer did not blindly follow Boccaccio. Both refined their mother tongues. Boccaccio refined the Italian language, Chaucer refined the English language. Even both narrated same stories, both narrated amusing stories, but as far as serious stories are concerned, Chaucer is superior in conveying too many ideas, a cluster of ideas in a few sentences. Chaucer knows brevity is the soul of wit. Dryden says, our countryman carries weight and yet wins the race at a disadvantage. That is, Boccaccio wrote in prose. Ideas were scattered. The style was marked by prolixity and diffuseness. But Chaucer has condensed his ideas in a few lines. The disadvantage for Chaucer was that he wrote in verse. But Boccaccio had an advantage because he wrote in prose. The medium of prose gave him freedom of thought, freedom of expression. But Chaucer had to struggle hard because he wrote in verse form. In the Italian language, perhaps some improvement was made by earlier writers like Dante and Petrarch. They did something. Dante and Petrarch did something for the refinement of the language. But in the case of English, Chaucer was the first to refine. Chaucer found the English language a brick and left it a marble. When Chaucer wrote, English was rough like a brick. Chaucer polished the rough language. In the manner of presentation also, Chaucer is superior. So he says Chaucer is superior to Boccaccio, though Chaucer borrowed stories from Boccaccio. Then he analyzes other qualities of Chaucer. He enters into a province of satire. Chaucer belongs to the 14th century. In the 14th century, a clergyman was godlike. No one should speak ill of a clergyman. A clergyman was an embodiment of all noble qualities of head and heart. But Chaucer condemned clergymen. This is what the critics spoke in the 18th century. John Dryden defends Chaucer's satire on clergymen. Dryden says, Chaucer never condemned the entire clergy profession. Chaucer's aim was to put a check for the immoral ways of some clergymen. Chaucer has given a very good account of a man like a parson. Parson is a clergyman. Chaucer is all admiration for a man like a parson. But same time, Chaucer was critical of a man like Monk, M-O-N-K, Monk. He is a corrupt priest, a dishonest priest. So Chaucer wanted to put a check for the dishonest, immoral, corrupt ways of some clergyman. Dryden says, a satirical poet is the check of a layman on bad priests. He wanted to check the immoral ways. Dryden says, when a clergyman is whipped, his gown is first taken off, by which the dignity of his order is secured. That is, as long as a clergyman was wearing the gown, the meaning is, as long as clergymen followed divine ways, God's ways, Chaucer was all admiration for the clergyman. When clergymen removed their gowns, Chaucer started whipping. The meaning is, when clergymen deviated from divine ways and followed devilish path, Chaucer fell foul upon them. So Chaucer's aim was to lampoon the dishonest and vulgar priests. John Dryden admires Chaucer's power of portrayal of characters. Dryden says, it is sufficient to say that according to the proverb, here is God's plenty. Chaucer created variety of characters. Just as God has created variety of human beings, Chaucer has created variety of characters in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer has given us a serious characters like a knight or parson, a minor character like a Reeve and Miller, a dishonest priest like the monk, an honest priest like the parson. He has created gap-toothed wife of Bath and mincing prioress. So Chaucer has given us a variety of characters in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Then John Dryden replies critics who found fault with John Dryden. Critics like Cowley and Leicester, they found fault with Dryden for translating Chaucer. One charge was, Chaucer is an old-fashioned wit. He does not deserve the labor of translation. Or they said John Dryden wasted his time and energy for translating the age-old 14th century scholar, that is Chaucer. John Dryden replies. Dryden says his aim was to spread the concepts of Chaucer all over the world. But Chaucer in the Middle English is not at all known to the world. Chaucer in the Middle English is like a rough diamond. He does not shine. Translating Chaucer from Middle English into modern English is like polishing a diamond. The more you polish the diamond, the more it shines. Rough diamond does not shine. So also Chaucer in the Middle English is like an unpolished diamond. Translation is like polishing a diamond, so that he is known all over the world. The second charge was, the critic said that half of the beauty of the original is lost. 50% of the beauty is lost. Dryden admits, Dryden accepts that something is missing in the translation. That is the case not only in his translation, that is the case in any translation. All the soul, all the spirit is not retained. Dryden says, the translation is not for the Anglo-Saxons. Anglo-Saxons are men who can understand Middle English. Dryden's translation is for those who need some help, who need some assistance to understand Chaucer. If there are Anglo-Saxons, if there are men who have knowledge of Middle English, they can read the original Chaucer from the library and enjoy all the beauty of Chaucer. the Anglo-Saxons need not read his translation. So he says the translation is not for the Anglo-Saxons. The third charge was that holiness is lost. Chaucer's literature is a sacred one. Chaucer's literature is a religious literature. Translation means it is like a harming religion. Translation is sacrilegious. John Dryden committed a sin in translating the sacred literature of Chaucer into English. They say the sanctity is lost. John Dryden replies this. John Dryden says, words are not like landmarks, so sacred as never to be removed. Customs are changed, habits are modified, even statutes are silently repealed when the reason ceases for which they were enacted. The customs of the people go on changing. The habits of the people go on changing. Even the constitutional laws are modified. A government implements a set of constitutional law. Even the constitutional laws are modified, cancelled or repealed when the purpose is over. So words are not holy. Words do not have meanings of their own. We only give meaning for the words. So he defends his translation of Chaucer. John Dryden wanted to write an epic poem. So he speaks of the qualities of an epic poem. For an epic poem, design, disposition, theme are very essential. They are the predominant elements in an epic poem. If anything is missing, it is an incomplete poem. Design, disposition, theme, they are like the pillars of a building. Pillars are very important. Hobbes said that diction is the predominant element. Dryden disagrees. Diction is only like a painting of a house, which is not very important. The pillars are very important. So when he speaks of the qualities of an epic poem, he says, where any of these are wanting, so much wants or is imperfect in the imitation of human life and so fails to fulfill the definition of a poem. If there is no design, it is an incomplete poem. If there is no disposition, it is an incomplete poem. If there is no theme, it is an incomplete poem. A complete poem is a criticism of life. A perfect poem analyzes life. A perfect poem interprets life. A complete poem tells us how to live. But if anyone is missing, it is an incomplete poem. Such a poem can't analyze life. When he speaks of these qualities, Dryden is reminded of the two great epic poets, Homer and Virgil. He says, our two great epic poets, being so different in their tempers, one choleric and sanguine, the other phlegmatic and melancholic. The one choleric means very angry. Sanguine means very confident. Homer's characters, they are very angry. They are very confident of what they say. The other is Virgil. Virgil's characters are very dull, very mechanical. They only make appeal. John Dryden is impressed by Homer's characters. He states, one warms you by degrees, the other sets you on fire all at once and never intermits heat. It is the same difference which Longinus makes between the effects of eloquence of Demosthenes and Tully Cicero. One warms you by degrees, that is Virgil's. Virgil's characters, they warm you by degrees. They make appeal to the audience. They are very sympathetic. They are very considerate. But Homer's characters, they make fiery speeches. They never intermit their heat. They keep the large audience spellbound by their oration. Here the comparison is, Longinus speaks of two orators, Demosthenes and Tully Cicero. Demosthenes only pleads the audience. He makes appeal to the audience. He is very sympathetic in his oration. But Tully Cicero, he commanded the audience by his oration. He could keep the large audience spellbound. Here, Demosthenes is compared with Virgil's characters. Tully Cicero is compared with Homer's characters. Virgil, for his portrayal of characters, was greatly influenced and inspired by Homer's characters. Dryden says, Dido cannot be denied to be the daughter of Calypso. Dido is Virgil's character. Calypso is Homer's character. Calypso is called a mother. Some of the qualities of a mother are genetically transmitted to a baby. When we look at a baby, we say that she walks like a mother, father, grandmother or grandfather. Here Dido cannot be denied to be the daughter of Calypso. It means Virgil, for his portrayal of characters like Dido, was indebted to Homer. It's another sentence. The manners of Aeneas. Aeneas is one of the heroes of Virgil. The manners of Aeneas are like that of Hector. Hector is again Homer's character. Virgil, for his portrayal of characters like Aeneas and Dido, was greatly inspired by Homer. Then John Dryden dismisses three critics. He settles scores with three critics. One is Milburn. Milburn made two charges against John Dryden. One is, John Dryden's poetry is not superior to that of Ogleby. For this Dryden replies, if you and I are placed, no one will call me an inferior poet. The second charge by Milburn was, John Dryden condemned London clergymen. John Dryden is ready to take apology from good clergymen if they were offended by his writings. When he takes apology, it is not an advantage to Milburn. The meaning is, when Dryden takes apology, it does not mean he takes apology from Milburn, because Milburn is also one of the clergymen. Dryden takes apology only from good clergymen. It is not an advantage to Milburn. That means Dryden is not taking apology from Milburn. So he dismisses Milburn. The next man with whom he settles scores is Blackmore. Earlier I told you John Dryden had an outline to write an epic poem. Blackmore surreptitiously, that is without the knowledge of Dryden, took the outline and wrote two epics. One is Prince Arthur, the other one is King Arthur. But Blackmore did not know how to develop the hints. Dryden had only hints and outline. Blackmore did not know how to develop those points. He omitted guardian angels. So Dryden says, those two epics are dead and gone. Let me not speak of the dead souls. The last man whom he dismisses is Jeremy Collier. Jeremy Collier found some vulgar, dishonest, obscene, sexual passages in Dryden's poetry. With Jeremy Collier, John Dryden develops a repenting tone. Dryden atones. Dryden feels sorry for the immoral, vulgar passages in his poetry. At same time, he replies, those immoral passages are only inadvertent entry. Unknowingly, unwittingly, some vulgar passages might have crept in. Dryden declares that he never wantonly, deliberately incorporated any vulgar passages in his poetry. At same time, he replaced Jeremy Collier. Just because Jeremy Collier found immoral passages, we can't say he is a pious man. He is a religious minded man. If Jeremy Collier is a pious man, a religious minded man, he will not be often speaking of filth, dirt, dust, sex in any poetry. Even in ancient poetry, sacred literature, he found immoral, vulgar passages. Another point is that Jeremy Collier actually distorted the actual meaning and found only offensive, vulgar meanings. John Dryden meant one thing in his poetry, but Jeremy Collier distorted the actual meaning and took only offensive meaning, vulgar meaning, sexual meaning to the lines of John Dryden. Dryden says, I will not say that the zeal of God's house has eaten him up. That is, the meaning is, John Dryden says that Jeremy Collier is not prompted by any religious feelings. If he is a religious minded man, he will not be often speaking of a filth, dirt, sex in any poetry. There are critics who are all admiration for this preface to the fables. Winsott and Clonthbrook call this as one of the mellowest expressions of his old age. Long is the name of a critic. Long admires Dryden's judgment of Chaucer. Garnett also admires John Dryden's appreciation of Chaucer. One critic calls this a masterpiece in judgment, method and style. Hugh Walker found in this not only energetic criticism, but revelation of Dryden's own self. So in the preface to fables, we get not only energetic criticism, but also revelation of Dryden's own self. This preface to the fables reveals John Dryden as a comparative critic. By publishing this preface to fables, John Dryden gained a name and fame in the world literary scene. He established himself as a comparatist. By comparing Chaucer with Boccaccio, comparing Chaucer with Ovid, by comparing Homer and Virgil, he has established himself as a comparative critic. This has gained a universal value. John Dryden has imparted a universal significance and universal value to this critical work. This critical work is not confined to any particular religion, not to particular nation, it is for the whole world. So John Dryden gained a name, a fame and reputation in the world literary scene. This reveals himself as a comparative critic because he has compared Chaucer with Ovid, Chaucer with Boccaccio, Homer and Virgil. By publishing this, John Dryden has established an undying reputation in the world literary scene.